There was a turning point in history when war stopped being about crowns and started being about credit. For centuries, empires rose and fell on the courage of men with swords. But eventually, courage was enough. Cannons needed iron. Gunpowder needed saltpeter. Ships needed timber, rope, insurance, and above all, credit. Armies became supply chains. And once war relied on supply chains, merchants moved closer to power than ever before. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and the surface story is never the real one. The arms trade did not begin with factories. It began with financing. In the late Middle Ages, European rulers were rarely at peace. Their wars were not yet total annihilation. They were territorial disputes, dynastic rivalries, religious campaigns. But they were expensive. Kings often lacked the coin to sustain prolonged conflict, so they borrowed. Italian banking families, particularly the Lombards, extended credit to monarchs who needed to hire mercenaries and purchase weapons. War was no longer decided only by bravery. It was determined by liquidity. By the 16th century, finance and force had fused. The Fugger family of Augsburg became indispensable to the Habsburg dynasty. In 1519, Jacob Fugger provided critical funding to help secure Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. A banking house had quietly shaped the political future of Europe. The Fuggers also supplied copper and silver essential for weapons manufacturing. They commanded no armies, yet they influenced who did. At the same time, Venice had already built something resembling an early military-industrial system. The Venetian arsenal employed thousands and mass-produced ships and cannons with remarkable efficiency. Venice didn't just defend itself. It exported military hardware across the Mediterranean. Weapons had become commodities, and commodities follow capital. Then came the 30 Years' War, one of Europe's most destructive conflicts. What began as a religious dispute escalated into a continental catastrophe involving Spain, France, Sweden, and numerous German states. Entire regions were devastated. Yet devastation created demand. Muskets, artillery, iron, powder. Under Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden became a major exporter of iron and weaponry. Dutch merchants traded across confessional lines. Neutral actors often supplied both sides. War might divide nations, but contracts cross borders. Here is the quiet truth. Ideology motivates soldiers. Contracts move supplies. By the 19th century, the equation changed again. War no longer required only financing and trade. It required industrial scale. Steel mills expanded. Railways transformed logistics. Explosives became more powerful and more precise. Conflict began to resemble an organized, mechanized enterprise. In Germany, the Krupp family built a steel empire that became synonymous with artillery production. During the Franco-Prussian War, Krupp cannons played a decisive role in Prussia's victory over France. Industrial output was no longer background support. It shaped outcomes. In Britain, major manufacturers like Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth supplied not only the British military, but foreign governments as well. The line between national defense and global commerce blurred further. Weapons were engineered in factories and distributed worldwide. Then, in 1867, Alfred Nobel patented dynamite. His invention revolutionized mining and construction and dramatically increased the destructive capacity of warfare. Later, when he established the Nobel Prizes, including the Peace Prize, many saw irony in the gesture. Wealth built on explosive force, partially redirected toward honoring peace. By the early 20th century, the arms industry was no longer simply responding to war. It was preparing for it. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 triggered a naval arms race between Britain and Germany. Older battleships became obsolete overnight. Shipyards accelerated. Steel output surged. Military budgets expanded. Each nation claimed defense. Each expansion compelled the other to match it. This was not chaos. It was momentum. Industrial, financial, political. Contracts flowed. Workers relied on defense wages. Investors relied on defense profits. Military capacity became woven into national economies. When World War I erupted, the machinery was ready. Machine guns, heavy artillery, submarines, poison gas, all products of industrial research and manufacturing. Governments mobilized entire economies. Factories shifted almost entirely to war production. The United States initially declared neutrality, but neutrality did not mean disengagement. American banks and corporations supplied the Allied powers extensively. J.P. Morgan and Company became the chief purchasing agent for Britain and France and the U.S., arranging billions in loans and facilitating massive arms procurement. By 1917, American financial ties to an Allied victory were immense. When the U.S. formally entered the war, financial alignment had already blurred into military commitment. War financing was not only patriotic, it was economic positioning. By 1918, the relationship between state and industry had transformed permanently. War required unprecedented debt issuance. It required propaganda to sell war bonds. It required coordination between governments and private enterprise, at scale never seen before. Citizens themselves became investors in conflict. Before industrialization, war was episodic. After industrialization, it became systemic. Factories remained. Infrastructure persisted. Expertise accumulated. The capacity for large-scale destruction embedded itself into national economies, and structures once embedded rarely disappear. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the devastation was staggering. Empires collapsed. Millions were dead. It seemed logical that such catastrophe would dismantle the system that enabled it. Instead, the system was investigated, not abolished. In 1934, amid the economic turmoil of the Great Depression, the U.S. Senate formed the Nye Committee, led by Senator Gerald Nye. Its mission was to examine the role of bankers and arms manufacturers in America's entry into World War I. The hearings exposed massive profits. Companies like DuPont had earned extraordinary sums from explosives. J.P. Morgan had arranged billions in Allied loans. The press popularized the haunting phrase, merchants of death. The accusation was not that financiers started the war. It was subtler and perhaps more unsettling. Once war began, financial incentives aligned with one side's victory. And when billions are at stake, neutrality becomes fragile, not conspiracy. Incentives. The hearings fueled isolationist sentiment, leading to neutrality acts intended to sever financial ties to foreign wars. But systems built over centuries do not vanish after public outrage. They adjust. Across the Atlantic, the 1930s were anything but calm. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, began rearming in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Industrial giants like Krupp expanded production once again. Britain and France responded by increasing defense spending. Rearmament was framed as deterrence. It always is. By 1939, World War II had begun, and its scale dwarfed everything before it. The United States, initially neutral, became what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Through the Lend-Lease Act, America supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations with weapons and materials, even before formally entering the war after Pearl Harbor. Factories roared. Automobile plants shifted to tank production. Aircraft manufacturing surged. By 1944, the U.S. was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year. Defense spending exploded from $1.9 billion in 1940 to over $59 billion by 1945. The American economy was effectively reorganized around war production. And here lies the uncomfortable economic truth. The Great Depression did not end through austerity or abstract theory. It ended through mobilization. War spending acted as fiscal stimulus. It absorbed unemployment. It expanded industrial capacity. It cemented coordination between government planners and private contractors. It created a model. When the war ended in 1945, many expected that apparatus to shrink dramatically. It did, but only partially. Almost immediately, geopolitical rivalry hardened into the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons changed the stakes. Deterrence required readiness. Readiness required production. Production required contracts. In 1961, outgoing President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell address and warned of the military-industrial complex. He was no outsider. He had commanded Allied forces in Europe. He understood military necessity, but he also understood incentives. He did not allege conspiracies. He described alignment. When regions depend on defense contracts for employment, corporations depend on long-term procurement for revenue, and politicians depend on those jobs for votes, the system sustains itself. It becomes self-reinforcing. Throughout the Cold War, defense spending remained structurally elevated. Companies such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon Technologies, and Northrop Grumman became embedded within the American economy. In the Soviet system, military production consumed vast state resources. Arms exports evolved into instruments of geopolitical leverage. By the late 20th century, the global arms trade had become measurable and institutionalized. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the United States accounts for roughly 40% of global arms exports in recent years. Fighter jets, missile systems, drones, all sold through contracts spanning decades and continents. Defense budgets remain among the largest components of national expenditure. The U.S. annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion. China's is estimated above $200 billion. NATO members collectively spend well over $1 trillion annually. War or preparation for it is not a pause in economic life. It is an economic sector. Like any sector, it has employees, shareholders, lobbyists, analysts, supply chains, and quarterly earnings. The arms trade today does not resemble medieval merchants selling swords to rival princes. It resembles multinational corporations operating within regulatory frameworks, exporting advanced systems under government approval. But the logic remains constant. Conflict creates demand. Demand creates contracts. Contracts create profit. Profit creates influence. Peace reduces urgency. This does not mean wars are fabricated purely for profit. That explanation is too simple. Wars arise from political, ideological, territorial, and security tensions. But when war preparation becomes economically embedded, incentives influence response. Budgets are defended. Threats are highlighted. Strategic narratives are amplified. In financial terms, the arms sector is countercyclical peace. During economic slowdowns, governments increase spending to stimulate growth. Infrastructure is one path. Defense is another, often facing less resistance. Military budgets are framed as essential, non-negotiable. Debt expands to fund them. Central banks accommodate. Markets absorb the cost. From Cold War standoffs to post-9/11 conflicts to present geopolitical tensions, defense spending surges during crisis. Contractors report earnings. Investors rebalance portfolios. Anticipation of conflict becomes priced into markets. Here is the deeper pattern. The arms trade did not corrupt an otherwise pure financial system. It evolved alongside it. As credit markets expanded and industrial capacity scaled, so did the ability to finance and produce violence. Money and power compound each other. The medieval banker funding a king's campaign. The 19th century industrialist forging artillery. The 20th century contractor securing procurement deals. The 21st century multinational exporting advanced defense systems. They are not isolated figures. They are links in a continuous chain. Empires did not fight simply because they could. They fought because they could afford to, and because someone ensured they could. The unsettling truth is not that arms merchants secretly control history. It is that incentives shape systems. When violence becomes scalable, financeable, and industrialized, it stops being extraordinary. Preparation becomes permanent. History does not repeat in identical form, but patterns endure. The 30 Years' War required iron and gunpowder. World War I required steel and credit. The Cold War required nuclear deterrence and trillion-dollar budgets. Today's world requires cyber capabilities, AI-driven systems, and globalized supply chains. Technology evolves. Incentives remain. If you want to understand inflation cycles, sovereign debt expansion, fiscal priorities, and global alliances, you cannot ignore the arms sector. It is embedded in the architecture of state power. Financial literacy is not just about stocks and bonds. It is about recognizing which industries are protected, which budgets are insulated, and which incentives persist regardless of election cycles. Empires did not collapse merely because they fought too many wars. They fought too many wars because the financial system made sustained conflict possible. History does not repeat, but if you fail to understand it, it will quietly shape your future anyway. If this perspective challenged how you see money and power, subscribe. History has answers. You just have to know where to look.